Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Now, as this is a hybrid hearing, I want to remind members of key regulations from the House Committee on Rules to ensure this hearing goes smoothly. Members must be visible on screen for purposes of identification when joining the hearing. Members must also continue to use the video function of today's software platform, Cisco WebEx, for the remainder of the time they're attending this hearing, unless experiencing connectivity issues or other technical problems. If a member has experienced any connectivity issues or other technical problems, please inform committee staff as soon as possible so you can receive assistance. A chat function is available for members on the Cisco WebEx platform for this purpose. Members can also call the committee's main phone line at 202-225-4472 for technical assistance by phone. Members may not participate remotely in any other proceeding that may be occurring simultaneously. It's the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute their microphone prior to speaking. To avoid any inadvertent background noise, I request that every member keep their microphone muted when not seeking recognition to speak. If I hear any inadvertent background noise, I'll request that the member please mute their microphone. Finally, despite this being a hybrid hearing, I want to emphasize that all the standard rules of decorum apply. As the chair of today's hearings, I will make a good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in the proceedings. Members will have the standard 5 minutes to ask questions. To insert a document to the record, please have your staff email it to the committee's clerk, Mike Twinick, at twincheck@mail.house.gov. This hearing is also being live streamed for the public to view. So now that I've gotten all those formalities taken care of, I should say the same applies to the witnesses. If you have any connectivity problems, we will make sure don't be concerned. We'll get all those things worked out. So we've been doing this for a few months now, and there's always some glitches, but hopefully everything will run smoothly today. So I want to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. I want to first say I will be a little more than 5 minutes. This is the last hearing of the subcommittee for the year, and a few things that I wanted to go over in addition to talking about today's hearing. So I want to first welcome you to the final hearing of the Railroad Pipeline Hazardous Material Subcommittee for the 116th Congress. And during a very tough 2 years, I'm very proud of the work that this subcommittee has done along with Chairman DeFazio. The House passed an historic surface transportation reauthorization bill that includes a robust $60 billion investment for rail infrastructure, the highest amount ever. As a strong proponent of passenger rail, I'm proud that we were able to include very significant Amtrak investment and to include a top priority of mine in making commuter railroads eligible for a greatly expanded CRISI grant program. That program, which can fund a wide variety of projects, including quiet zones, grade separations, and station improvements, was expanded to $7 billion over 5 years. Another priority of mine that will improve safety and reduce delays was establishment of a dedicated grade separation program. Now, I'm optimistic that in the Biden administration and under the leadership of Chairman DeFazio, this bill will get done. As far as other work under the subcommittee for the rest of this year, I remain very hopeful that we complete a pipeline safety reauthorization bill and have that signed into law. Now, in our hearing today, we'll be looking at Surface Transportation Board's role in ensuring we have a robust national passenger rail system, both intercity and commuter. The STB was last reauthorized 5 years ago, and that authorization expired on October 1st. So this is a good time to be talking about this issue. I'm also hopeful that the STB will get its full 5 confirmed board members, which was authorized in the 2015 bill. I'm not just a big supporter of passenger rail. I'm a frequent passenger on both Metra commuter rail at home and on Amtrak. To achieve a more robust passenger rail system, both intercity and commuter, we need to do a few things. First, we should significantly increase the amount of public investment in rail infrastructure. Second, we'll have to expand our domestic rail supply industry so we can meet the demand. Finally, we'll need to establish a more balanced and efficient process to utilize existing trackage, much of which is owned by freight railroads, for expanded passenger rail service. Trying to expand passenger rail service on new right-of-way is just not feasible from a cost or time perspective in a majority of the country. In the places that it is feasible, we should have public investment while also encouraging private investment. But where this is not feasible, the expansion of current rail lines does not need to be contentious. Investments by the public sector to establish or expand passenger rail service can also help freight railroads by increasing freight capacity when not used by passenger rail service. This model in particular has been used to great success by BNSF Railroad. The Surface Transportation Board is a critical part of this future, which is why I wanted to have a hearing focused on the STB's role in helping achieve a better and more expansive passenger rail system. Congress in recent years has expanded STB's jurisdiction on intercity passenger rail, but more is needed. With respect to intercity passenger rail, the STB has a responsibility for adjudicating any disputes when Amtrak or another railroad wants to initiate new rail service on an existing rail line. In Northern Illinois, there's been a long-standing interest in starting new rail service between Chicago and the Quad Cities. A significant amount of federal and state funds have been allocated to this project, but it has been caught in continuing delays due to a lack of cooperation. We should look more at what could be done in situations such as this. Beginning in 2008, STB was assigned the task of enforcing the Federal Railroad Administration's on-time intercity rail performance metrics. The recent publication of the on-time performance rule by the FRA makes the STB's role in solving Amtrak freight disputes even more critical. Though it's mentioned in the written testimony, Amtrak may want to add more about the agency's desire for the STB to have additional authority and expertise to solve Amtrak freight disputes in a timely and cost-effective manner, just like the STB has done to resolve shipper disputes. Unlike Amtrak, Metra and other commuter railroads do not have a statutory federal preference prioritizing commuter trains over freight trains. Additionally, commuter railroads generally do not have standing to bring cases before the STB. Therefore, commuter railroads have very limited leverage when it comes to trying to expand their service on freight rail lines or ensuring that freight railroads do not delay commuter trains. This is oftentimes not a problem, as I've been involved in helping Metra work with a number of railroads to successfully expand and improve service on their lines in the Chicagoland region. An excellent example is when I worked with Norfolk Southern to create opportunities to start weekend service through my district for the Southwest service line. So I'd like to take note that freight railroads can be collaborative partners to help improve commuter service, and they have been in many times. But sometimes there are issues. For these occasions, I believe that Congress should establish a dispute resolution process between commuter railroads and freight railroads at the STB. If this is not enough to help give commuters the type of service they deserve, perhaps Congress should take a balanced look at other options that can help improve service for commuters. With all these challenges, there must be a better, yet still balanced way that can achieve desirable outcomes for public and private stakeholders. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today on the role of the Surface Transportation Board in helping achieve better passenger rail system. I'd like to welcome two witnesses in particular today. One is Metra's new chairwoman, Romaine Brown. Chairwoman Brown made history this year as the first African-American woman to chair Metra. She brings a lifetime of experience in public transit in Chicagoland to the position. Second, we have Marty Overman, current vice chair of STB, who I've known for about 45 years, although I hate to admit that for either of us. I believe this is the first non-confirmation congressional hearing he has testified at. So a warm welcome to both of you and all of our witnesses. With that, I thank everyone for their indulgence for this time here, and I'm going to yield to Ranking Member Crawford for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lipinski, for holding this hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I especially want to thank Chairman Lipinski for his leadership of this subcommittee and his willingness to operate in a bipartisan manner. I appreciate my friend's thoughtful approach on rail and pipeline safety issues, and will miss working with him, and I certainly wish him the best in every future endeavor. Our hearing today is to review how the Surface Transportation Board works to support passenger railroads. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated our nation's passenger rail network. Amtrak has significantly cut its routes, announced large cuts to its workforce, and has requested record amounts of taxpayer funding for this fiscal year. We must work to ensure that Amtrak services return in a way that offers the most benefit to riders and makes responsible use of the taxpayer resources required to keep it running. We must also balance the needs of passenger rail with the most important needs of our nation's robust and resilient freight rail network. We cannot discuss important issues such as preference, on-time performance, and Amtrak schedules without fully considering the needs of the freight railroads and their rail network, which have continued to deliver essential goods throughout the country during this difficult year. The Surface Transportation Board, Amtrak, and the FRA have addressed these issues recently, including through decisions and rulemaking that seek to improve and modernize on-time performance metrics and standards. Thank you again to all of our witnesses for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crawford, and you saved everyone time. I guess I used up your time in my statement, but thank you for it's been great working with you over these past 2 years. So thank you very much for all of your cooperation, our work together.
My privilege. Thank you.
With that, I'm going to recognize the full committee chairman, Peter DeFazio.
Thanks, Chairman Lipinski and Ranking Member Crawford for today's hearing on the STB's role in ensuring a robust passenger rail system. I would note it is Chairman Lipinski's last hearing, and I want to thank him for his years of service to this committee and all the constructive work he has done. This is obviously a challenging time for Amtrak. You know, the intercity and commuter rail has been decimated by the pandemic. You know, this puts, you know, additional burdens on both, you know, Amtrak's budget and on city and state budgets also. The House has taken the initiative now well, 3 times, CARES, HEROES 1, HEROES 2, to pass a comprehensive COVID relief bill that would include support for Amtrak and commuter rail. Hopefully, the McConnell-led Senate will see the wisdom of providing some additional assistance in this time of economic crisis and pandemic in the near future. You know, passenger rail is an important part of the climate change puzzle. It is extremely efficient, fuel efficient, much more so than individual passenger vehicles, buses, and airplanes, obviously. You know, the commuter systems in particular take cars off our congested roadways and reduce short-haul flights. I think there's tremendous potential in city pairs that are 100 to 500 miles apart if we have dependable and at least higher speed service. I'm not even going to talk about high speed. You know, Eugene to Portland, 110 miles, supposed to be 2 hours, 35 minutes. Last time I took it was 3 hours and 30 minutes. If they could get it near 2:15 regularly, there are hundreds and hundreds of more passengers who would take that train every day rather than getting on Interstate 5, which is frequently blocked because of wrecks, and you can't predict how long it's going to take you to get to Portland. Same to Seattle. You know, these kind of city pairs have tremendous potential to displace commuter flights and to displace traffic on our highways. You know, but you know, they have to run on time. This has been a challenge in Oregon. And as I mentioned, the southbound Cascade state-supported route had a 58.3% on-time performance rate. Totally unacceptable, and it's not a way to grow passenger rail service. You know, freight delays are a significant source of Amtrak delays. Most Amtrak trains outside of the Northeast Corridor run on tracks owned by the freight railroads. Freights are legally required to give preference to Amtrak when dispatching trains. This preference was part of the bargain when Congress many years ago created Amtrak and relieved freight railroads of their common carrier obligations to transport passengers. It was not rescinded, it was just transferred to Amtrak. But for many years, there have been questions about whether the freight railroads are holding up their end of the deal by giving preference to Amtrak trains. In fact, Congress included provisions to fix Amtrak on-time performance in 2008. That is when Pria added provisions directing the FRA and Amtrak to work to develop on-time performance metrics standards to be used as a basis for an STB investigation. Unfortunately, those benefits haven't been realized. It's been 12 years since Pria was passed. FRI's metric and standards for on-time performance were published this last Monday, 12 years later, for the second time. And after this long and unacceptable delay, I look forward to seeing an improvement on Amtrak's performance both in my state and nationwide. I do believe that we can have a very healthy and robust freight rail system. We're going to hear from today. The Amtrak testimony will be provided by a former train dispatcher who says that you just can't believe that freights say, well, we've got to run one train on that route today, and therefore you're going to be unnecessarily delayed. That they can't coordinate these things better. We're willing to partner with the freight railroads. In my state, we built some additional sidings, but now they've lengthened the trains to the point where they can't use those sidings. There has to be some compromise here, and we've got to find a middle ground to have a robust freight system, because freight rail is the most efficient way to move large amounts of freight in this country, much more so than trucks, obviously. The only thing more efficient is maritime, and that won't get us everywhere in the country. I want to weigh in on the disputes between Amtrak and commuter railroads. Both Amtrak and the commuter railroads require the same scarce access to tracks and platforms in major urban areas. It's expensive to maintain and expand, modernize this infrastructure, but there is no commuter railroad that I'm aware of that makes money. And Amtrak only claims to make money on the NEC. Neither can subsidize the other. Worldwide, I'm not aware of any railroads, passenger railroads, that make money, although Virgin claims they do in England because they don't have to maintain the tracks. Pretty easy to make money if all you have to do is put a train set on it and run it back and forth. That's not the major expense. So, to say that we shouldn't be subsidizing commuter or we shouldn't be subsidizing Amtrak is just saying you don't want to run trains because everywhere else in the world they're subsidized. But my message to commuter and to Amtrak is you have to work together and resolve the massive challenges you face. And this committee will be happy to help play a role in facilitating that coordination and cooperation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, and thank you for all your work and the work you will continue to do. I very much enjoyed working with you over all these years. You certainly, you know the issues very well, and glad to see that you are continuing on now. So With that, I want to welcome our witnesses for our panel today. We have Ms. Ann D. Begman, the chairwoman of the Surface Transportation Board, Mr. Martin J. Oberman, vice chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, Ms. Romaine C. Brown, chair of the board of directors of Metra, Mr. Stephen Gardner, senior executive vice president of Amtrak, Mr. Ian Jeffries, president and chief executive officer, Association of American Railroads, Mr. Randall O'Toole, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and Mr. Paul Skoutelis, president and chief executive officer, American Public Transit Association. Thank you all for participating today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Now, since your written testimony has been made part of the record, subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And now we're going to proceed with the testimony in the order that I read out the names of the witnesses. And we will begin with Ms. Begman. You may proceed.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Mr. Lipinski, this is also, I believe, my last hearing as chairman of the STB, so thank you for the opportunity. And I also would like to thank Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Crawford and all of the members for allowing my colleague Martin and I to testify before you. We greatly appreciate your interest in the Surface Transportation Board's work and welcome the opportunity to discuss our passenger rail service jurisdiction. I'll begin by discussing that role, and Marty will then discuss the board's other important work. And I also do want to acknowledge our other board member colleague, Patrick Fuchs, who was not asked to testify today. My two colleagues joined the board in January of 2019, and we have worked to timely resolve our cases and whenever possible to resolve them by consensus, and I want to thank them. As you know, the board's jurisdiction over intercity passenger rail carriers is more limited than its jurisdiction over freight rail carriers. In general, intercity passenger rail operations are subject to board jurisdiction when they provide rail service between two states. An example is Desert Express, which has proposed constructing a high-speed rail line between Southern California and Las Vegas, Nevada. There are also intercity passenger rail projects that operate within a single state, but still fall within the board's jurisdiction because of their extensive links to the interstate rail network, typically through their connections with Amtrak. An example is Texas Central's proposed high-speed rail line between Dallas and Houston. Initially, in 2016, the board found that it did not have jurisdiction over the project as proposed at the time because the line would neither have been part of nor sufficiently connected to the interstate rail network. However, in July of this year, the board found the proposed line would be part of the interstate rail network and therefore subject to the board's jurisdiction. This finding was based on new evidence presented by Texas Central, showing both a clearly defined through ticketing arrangement with Amtrak and a transfer service that would facilitate the movement of passengers in interstate commerce. In contrast, an intercity passenger rail service that operates within a single state and does not connect with the interstate rail network would not fall within the board's jurisdiction. For example, the board found in 2012 that the all-aboard Florida service planned between Miami and Orlando was not within the board's jurisdiction due to its lack of connectivity to the national rail network. Other examples of such operations include tourist and excursion trains, which typically operate within a single state and do not interchange passengers with the interstate carriers. Most intercity passenger rail service is provided by Amtrak, which is statutorily excluded from many of the board's regulatory requirements applicable to freight carriers. However, with the enactment of the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Act of 2008, Pria, which both Chairman Lipinski and Chairman DeFazio have mentioned in their opening comments, as well as the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act of 2015, FAST Act, the board assumed additional Amtrak oversight responsibilities, including the authority to conduct investigations under certain circumstances and, when appropriate, to award relief and identify reasonable measures to improve performance on passenger rail routes. As you know, lengthy litigation over the constitutionality of the Pria provision directing the FRA and Amtrak to establish on-time performance metrics and standards has prevented the board from fully utilizing this authority before now. After the constitutional issues were finally resolved last year, the FRA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on its new on-time performance and service metrics and standards. That rule, as you have heard, was finalized on Monday. And when it becomes effective, the board expects to be able to fully exercise its authority under the law. The board generally does not have jurisdiction over public passenger transportation provided by local governments, which includes commuter rail passenger transportation and services such as trolley, subway, and light rail lines. Under Pria, however, the board is authorized to mediate disputes involving commuter rail providers seeking access to freight railroad tracks and services. The board also has certain limited jurisdiction over matters involving commuter services, including establishing appropriate compensation paid by the commuter rail provider to Amtrak for use of certain Amtrak facilities when the parties cannot reach an agreement on their own. The board is currently handling several pending matters involving passenger and commuter services. One involves Metra's continued use of Amtrak's Chicago Union Station. In that case, which the vice chairman has recused himself, the board required Amtrak to continue to provide access to Metra on an interim basis while the parties participate in board-sponsored mediation, which was recently extended at the parties' joint request. Similarly, in a petition filed by the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, SEPTA, to determine compensation for the use of certain Amtrak stations and parking facilities, the board required Amtrak to continue to provide access on an interim basis while granting a joint motion to hold the proceeding in abeyance while the parties continue negotiations. In another matter, the board issued interim findings and guidance to Amtrak and the Canadian National Railway, and we initiated board-sponsored mediation in an effort to establish reasonable terms and conditions for Amtrak's use of CN's facilities and services. Finally, the board is also considering a request by Desert Express to modify the route of the previously authorized high-speed rail line between California and Nevada. As these proceedings are pending, we will not be able to comment further on them, but we did want to highlight them for the board. While freight matters do comprise the bulk of the work before the board, our passenger rail work is important. And I will now turn to Vice Chairman Oberman and thank the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Begman, for your testimony, and I'll recognize Mr. Oberman. You may proceed. Vice Chair.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Lipinski, and Ranking Member Crawford. I am delighted to be here. As the chairman said, it's my first non-confirmation appearance before Congress since I served there in 1959 as a page. I will say this, I am a champion of passenger rail, but it's my privilege at this hearing to really summarize for the committee what our activities have been in the last 2 years involving primarily our freight rail responsibilities. And we have done a lot. Under the very robust leadership of Chairman Begeman, we have tackled the congressional mandate to come up with a program to reduce the cost, complexity, and duration of rate reasonableness cases, stemming from the report which Chairman Begeman commissioned in 2018 through a rate reform task force. Since that task force report was issued in April of 2019, we've done the following. We adopted a new rule creating a streamlined process for establishing market dominance, which is a prerequisite for any shipper challenging a rate to satisfy before the board. Last December, we held a 2-day hearing on the subject of revenue adequacy, which is quite complicated, and that consideration is ongoing. We also adopted a rule amending our waybill sample data collection regulation, so we will have a much more thorough database that will assist the board and the stakeholders in decision-making and analysis. And perhaps most importantly, we proposed a rule establishing a new rate reasonableness method called final offer rate review. Excuse me. Because this is such an important undertaking, we used our statutory authority to set up a series of ex parte discussions with the railroads and shipping sides of the industry, and last spring held many meetings to discuss both the for proposal and alternatives, including one proposed by some of the class ones to establish a voluntary arbitration procedure. As the committee may know, the board lacks the authority to mandate arbitration of rate matters, but a proposal has come forward to set up a methodology which the railroads propose to agree to voluntarily if it's adopted. I should emphasize that the rulemaking on final offer is ongoing and remains one of the board's top priorities. The other major area of undertaking was to consider issues involving demurrage and accessorial charges, which had begun to skyrocket back in 2018. In the spring of 2019, we held a 2-day hearing on the subject, out of which emanated a series of actions by the board, including the adoption of a very lengthy policy statement setting forth the principles the board will utilize when we evaluate demurrage claims that come before the board, and presumably will be also used by the courts when they consider these matters. We've also proposed to have a pending rule that will greatly enhance the transparency and clarity of demurrage invoices, providing rail customers with a much more detailed information about the nature of charges so they can evaluate whether to pay them or challenge them. We clarified regulations revoking certain exemptions so that certain exempt commodities can appear before the board on demurrage matters. And we issued a final rule which clarifies the relationship between warehousemen and shippers in terms of demurrage bills. One other additional area to mention is that the board has very vigorously been monitoring and staying in touch with both the railroads and the shippers as this pandemic has unfolded, and monitoring the progress of service, including, very importantly, monitoring what has been happening as the economy has begun to return, making sure that the railroads are in a position to restore crew sizes and equipment that had necessarily been furloughed when the economy really went in a downward trend last spring. And we've had very active cooperation with both railroads and rail customers. And for the most part, I would say we are impressed with the great effort put forward by all to try to keep our economy running as much as possible. But it is a challenge to gear back up now that rail traffic has begun to increase. We specifically have asked the railroads, along with the FRA, we asked the railroads to keep us posted on their efforts to restore their crew sizes and the amount of equipment available so that service will be adequate. Finally, I just want to add on a very personal note, and I was going to acknowledge Chairman Lipinski, that it was 45 years ago that your father and I entered the Chicago City Council on the very same day, and I have known you since then. So we have a very long history, and I wanted to take a personal moment to congratulate you on your spectacular service in the Congress on behalf of certainly the country, but certainly the Chicago area. We really have benefited from the effort you've done in the area of transportation, championing not only rail, but all infrastructure, highways, and aviation as well. The list is too long to cite everything you've done, but two, which are really of great importance to the railroads, particularly in the Midwest, but this affects the nation, are the huge hundreds of millions of dollars that you've helped obtain for the CREATE program, which is straighten out the entire North American system if we could get things running more smoothly through Chicago. And you're adding at least $1.5 billion or nearly that to the Chrissy grant program. There are many, many other things. And I, for one, will say that the country is going to miss your chairmanship of this committee, and the city of Chicago and the Chicago region benefited from your service, and we will miss your being around. But I know you're going to be around in some capacity. But I wanted to add that as a personal note. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. The chair will now recognize Ms. Brown for 5 minutes. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Lipinski. Good morning, Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of this esteemed subcommittee. First, I want to thank Chairman Lipinski for all that he has done for transportation in his district in Chicagoland. His advocacy in Congress has meant so much to so many in the Chicago region. I also wanted to extend my sincere appreciation to Congressman Garcia, from the Chicago City Council to the Illinois General Assembly to the Cook County Board of Commissioners and now the U.S. Congress. He has been a tremendous advocate for social equity and infrastructure, and his efforts have made a real difference to so many in meaningful ways, especially for the underserved and minority communities. I'm also pleased to be on this panel with my former colleague and friend, STB Chair Marty Oberman. My name is Romaine Brown, and I am the chair of Metra's Board of Directors. I have been elected in September. I have served on the board since 2013, representing Cook County. I've worked for over 30 years as a professional transit manager at the Chicago Transit Authority, ending my career as Vice President of Rail Operations. This includes focusing on a strong relationship with our unionized employees, creating a safe, efficient, and pleasurable experience for our customers. I am particularly proud about the Fair Transit South Cook project, a 3-year pilot program that will lower Metra fares and provide new transit options for South suburban Cook County and the Chicago residents, some of the most underserved communities in our region. Metra operates the most complex commuter railroad network in the United States. We share infrastructure with 6 Class 1 railroads and Amtrak. The density of the Chicago network provides us with unique insight into the appropriate role the STB could and should take in passenger railroad policy. However, before discussing the role of STB, I would be remiss to not mention the difficult times all Americans are facing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Like many families and small businesses around the country, the transit industry is facing unique financial and safety challenges. We appreciate Congress' support in passing the $25 billion in emergency relief through the CARES Act. It has been critical to the continued safe operation of our commuter service in Chicago, and ensures we maintain and pay our dedicated unionized workforce. Yet, we continue to face financial challenges. On November 13th, Metra approved our budget for 2021. We are projected at least a $70 million budget gap in 2021 due to our extremely low ridership. We join our colleagues at the APTA and the many hardworking and dedicated rail labor unions in calling for this Congress to enact at least another $32 billion in emergency transit relief immediately. Simultaneously, the commuter rail industry faced significant operating and capital funding challenges that the federal government should address. The transit investment contained in this subcommittee Invest Act represents a significant progress for our agency, but more must be done. like creating commuter rail-only funding streams. We are a highly regulated, capital-intense commuter railroad. We are a passenger railroad without full standing at the STB. The STB is traditionally known as the economic regulator of the rail industry, focused on freight rail and shipper concern, but it also must play and can an important role in passenger rail policy. Yet, in its founding charter, it excluded public transportation provided by local government authorities from its jurisdiction. We believe that Congress should correct this situation and ensure parity and level playing field amongst all publicly subsidized passenger railroads. Since Congress created Amtrak in 1970, the growth of the commuter rail industry has been stunning. In the years of Amtrak's founding, there was only one commuter railroad. Today, there are over 30, and in 2019, our industry served nearly 500 million passengers. Over the last 50 years, as all of these new commuter railroads were created, it was clear that commuter operators should have the same rights and privileges as freight railroads and Amtrak. This is not an indictment of our freight railroad partners. As an operator in Chicago, we have developed close and reliable partnerships with freight railroads as we work together to deliver service through the nation's most congested rail corridor. In fact, our region owes much to the freight railroad industry through our successful partnership in the CREATE program. However, even great partnerships can be challenged. Yet, unlike Amtrak, we lack the same ability to resolve disputes over right-of-way, on-time performance, and track access at the STB. Metra looks forward to working with Congress as it debates surface transportation reauthorization, emergency COVID-19 relief, and of course, reauthorization of the STB. On behalf of Metra, I thank you for providing me with the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Brown. Now recognize Mr. Gardner. You may proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Lipinski, Chairman DeFazio, and Ranking Member Crawford, members of the subcommittee, and my fellow witnesses. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the Surface Transportation Board's key role in enabling Amtrak to effectively serve the nation. We strongly support the STB and believe the board needs updated authority and additional resources for passenger rail so we can achieve the service levels and on-time performance your constituents deserve. Congress created Amtrak in 1970 to take on a job that today's freight railroads no longer wanted. In exchange for Amtrak's assumption of these private railroads' common carrier obligation for passengers and the associated operating losses for passenger service, the freights agreed to allow Amtrak to operate wherever and whenever it wanted over their lines, to provide Amtrak trains with dispatching preference over freight, and to empower what is now the STB to ensure Amtrak's access to the rail network. It's been nearly 50 years since the freight railroads agreed eagerly to this bargain, and yet today, many of our host railroads fall short in fulfilling some of these key obligations.
Mr. Gardner, if you'll suspend, we can't see you, and we need to be able to, you need to have your video on. We need to be able to see you for you to be able to testify.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that better?
We see you now.
All right, sorry.
You can continue.
Great, thank you. Since our founding, Congress has had to clarify and amend the law to try and ensure host compliance. For example, by 1973, the freights had begun delaying Amtrak trains so severely that Congress enshrined this promise of Amtrak preference into federal law. And in 2008, delays had gotten so bad that Congress created a new process to set Amtrak on-time performance and provided the STB with the authority to investigate poor OTP. But for several reasons, these efforts haven't remedied the problems. For Amtrak and your constituents, that has meant millions of delayed passengers and years of impediment as we try to add trains or start new routes to keep up with changing markets and demand. As the AAR made clear in its litigation opposing the Pria metrics and standards rule, many hosts see supporting our operation not as their obligation to the public, but as competition for the use of their infrastructure. But Amtrak wasn't created to relieve host railroads of their requirements to support passenger trains. It was created to help them reduce financial losses and ensure that passenger trains could still serve the country. We need this committee's help to restore your original deal with the freights. For example, you can provide us, as you have in the Moving Forward Act, a way to enforce our existing rights of preference. You can make real Amtrak's statutory ability to start new routes and add additional trains without arbitrary barriers. You can create an Office of Passenger Rail within the STB and require them to use their investigative powers to pursue significant instances of poor OTP. And you can require more efficient STB processes to grant Amtrak access to hosts and fairly set any compensation and capital investment requirements. To be clear, Amtrak strongly supports our freight railroads. We want the whole rail network to grow and succeed, and we have some great host railroad partners who deliver very good service to Amtrak. But today, many freights seem to essentially view us and our millions of passengers as an imposition to be minimized instead of a valuable public service to be supported. And this is why we and the STB must have clear and appropriate authority to support our mission. I'm pleased to say that just this week, FRA and Amtrak took an important step in this direction with the publication of the Pria Metrics and Standards rule. This rule will empower the STB to investigate poor performance and help enforce Amtrak's preference rights, which could make a huge difference in train performance. As our CEO, Bill Flynn, recently testified, we're hopeful that with COVID relief funding and your support, we can quickly restore service and recover from this pandemic, setting in motion a new era of growth and a chance for Amtrak to play a significant role in helping reduce carbon emissions across the country. A rarely heralded fact is that the U.S. has the largest rail network in the world, and yet we use so little of it for intercity passenger rail service. Fundamental reason for this is our inability to gain quick, reasonable access to the network and receive reliable service that we are owed under law. This has effectively blocked our growth and left much of our nation underserved. City pairs like Los Angeles and Phoenix, or Atlanta to Nashville, could clearly benefit from Amtrak service, and existing rail lines already connect them. Shouldn't Amtrak trains be serving these and many other similar corridors nationwide? With your help, we can answer this question with a yes, by gaining strengthened rights and proper STB enforcement, coupled with a long-term, dedicated source of funding for both Amtrak and intercity passenger rail expansion. With these, we can provide the type of modern and reliable intercity passenger rail service that nearly every other developed nation now takes for granted. I want to thank you particularly, Chairman Lipinski, for your longstanding support of Amtrak, for your leadership role throughout many issues affecting Amtrak, and for your time with the committee. We've always appreciated your support. Thank you very much for it. And I look forward to answering any of the questions from the committee. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Mr. Jeffries, you may proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Lipinski, Chairman DeFazio, and Ranking Member Crawford, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today representing America's freight railroads. As America continues to navigate the ongoing challenges related to the COVID-19 pandemic, railroads are diligently focused on the task at hand, safely and reliably delivering essential goods to businesses and communities across the U.S. While the railroad value proposition to the American public has many sides, I want to highlight three specific areas. First, railroads have taken extensive steps to protect their employees from the coronavirus throughout the pandemic with required PPE use, strict social distancing policies, and rigorous cleaning procedures. Our industry is fortunate to have employees whose adherence to myriad safety measures is a constant, and they deserve our gratitude for their dedication. Second, railroads continue to provide safe and reliable service for customers across the economy. As a result of sustained investment and nimble operations, railroad service levels have remained strong this year, a reality that has been highlighted by federal officials and prominent customers alike. And broad safety measures are also encouraging, with the overall employee injury rate down 12% so far from 2019, while the train accident rate is down 11%. Third, railroads are playing a key role in helping support the nation's economic recovery. As businesses and consumer behavior has seen dramatic swings this year, such as the boom in e-commerce or the aggressive ramp up in auto manufacturing, or even the strong uptick in grain shipments, railroads have flexed operations to meet these challenges. Turning to passenger rail, freight railroads continue to work closely with Amtrak and other passenger partners, adjusting to meet changing needs in the face of unprecedented ridership challenges. While some passenger service offerings have been suspended in recent months, freight railroads stand ready to work with their partners to restore pre-existing service when appropriate. Looking ahead, discussions regarding expansion of passenger rail must recognize Amtrak's unique position and not confuse growth of commuter rail with any perception of access rights. Voluntary agreements with privately owned freight railroads govern such arrangements and have proven extremely successful. Regarding on-time performance, the Federal Railroad Administration's final rule recognizes that schedules must be updated and aligned. Even regardless of the rule, though, host railroads have been engaged and remain committed to working towards schedule modernization with Amtrak. If agreed upon schedules are in place and true causes of delay are accurately identified by transparent data, OTP metrics can be a meaningful tool. As an independent subject matter expert that adjudicates disputes between Amtrak and its hosts, the Surface Transportation Board does have a productive role to play in this process. But more broadly, the STB has been active on numerous fronts regarding economic regulation of freight rail, many of which you heard about with our prior witness. Regardless of the specifics of any regulatory proposal, it is critical that the board proceed in a manner that is data-driven and fully grounded in sound economic principles. A regulatory environment that promotes investment versus one that dissuades is at stake. In closing, while our nation is currently facing complex challenges, freight railroads stand ready to work towards solutions. From helping drive economic recovery, fostering infrastructure investment, or addressing environmental concerns, railroads will play a central role. And public policy set forth by Congress and federal regulators plays an important role in the continuity of robust rail operations throughout the country. As this committee re-examines surface transportation reauthorization next Congress, divisive policy measures should be cast aside, and the laser focus should be robust investment into the nation's integrated infrastructure network that all stakeholders can support. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. We now move on to Mr. O'Toole. Mr. O'Toole, you may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Chairman Lipinski, I appreciate the picture behind you, which I'm sure Chairman DeFazio knows is the Southern Pacific Shasta Daylight passing Odell Lake in the Oregon Cascades. I once rode that train when I was a boy, and more recently have been on the Amtrak Coast Starlight past that very same lake. Now, last year, the average American traveled more than 15,000 miles by automobile, flew more than 2,000 miles, rode several hundred miles on buses, walked more than 100 miles, rode 100 miles by urban rail transit, and bicycled 26 miles. Meanwhile, Amtrak carried the average American just 19 miles. Of course, a few people rode Amtrak a lot more than 19 miles, and most didn't ride it at all. In contrast, almost everyone relies on the railroads for deliveries of freight. When considering the role of the federal government in general and the Surface Transportation Board in particular in supporting Amtrak, we should remember that 1/3 of freight ton miles go by train, but only 0.1% of passenger travel rides Amtrak. Now, I love passenger trains, but I see Amtrak's creation as a mistake based on erroneous assumptions about the value of passenger trains and the problems faced by the private railroads. In 1970, the railroad's main problem was not money-losing passenger trains, but overregulation by the federal and state governments. Regulation or not, passenger trains were unable to compete against airlines and automobiles. A 1958 Interstate Commerce Commission report concluded that there was no way to make passenger trains profitable. Yet some passenger train advocates believed that passenger train losses were imaginary, and the railroads simply preferred freight trains over passenger trains. In fact, In the 1960s, railroads had a huge surplus in capacity and would have welcomed any kind of train that covered its basic operating costs. In 1969, Anthony Haswell, founder of the National Association of Railroad Passengers, made it clear in a congressional hearing that he believed passenger trains could be profitable, and he specifically objected to government subsidies to passenger train operations, noting that such subsidies would protect inefficiencies in the rail industry and give operators little or no incentive to reduce expenses or increase revenues on their own initiative. He predicted that such subsidies have the risk of becoming permanent drains on government revenues without commensurate public benefits. The 1970 collapse of Penn Central shook the industry. Congress should have responded by eliminating the overregulation that was stifling the railroads. Instead, it created Amtrak with the expectation that it would be a for-profit corporation and that taking passenger trains off the railroad's hands would save them from bankruptcy. 50 years and more than $50 billion in operating subsidies later, we know that Amtrak isn't and never will be profitable. Anthony Haswell is sometimes called the father of Amtrak, yet he has called Amtrak a legendary boondoggle and admitted that he is personally embarrassed by the organization he helped create. His prediction that operating subsidies to passenger trains would eliminate any incentive to reduce expenses or increase revenues is proven correct. When Amtrak was created, average rail fares per passenger mile were 2/3 of average airfares. Thanks to airline deregulation, since then, inflation-adjusted airfares have fallen by 60%, even as Amtrak fares per passenger mile have doubled. Average Amtrak fares exceeded airfares by 1990 despite huge operating subsidies, or perhaps, as Haswell predicted, because those subsidies encouraged inefficiencies. Today, counting all subsidies to both Amtrak and the airlines, Amtrak spends more than 4 times as much as the airlines moving someone a passenger mile. The airlines have made themselves so efficient that they attract well over 100 times as much domestic travel as Amtrak. The creation of Amtrak didn't particularly help railroads such as the Milwaukee Road, which went out of business after Amtrak took over. Instead, railroads revived only when Congress passed the Staggers Act in 1980. One of the effects of deregulation was that railroads shed the surplus capacity that they once had that would have been available to passenger trains. Today, thanks to more efficient operations, rail routes that once saw only a handful of trains per day support 60, 70, or 80 or more freight trains a day. This sometimes leaves little room for Amtrak. Displacing a money-making freight train with a money-losing passenger train is especially unfair, considering that so few people use the passenger trains while so many rely on freight. Passenger trains are pretty, but they're an obsolete form of transportation. Efforts to give passenger trains preferences over freight will harm more people than it will help. I believe the federal government should end its support of Amtrak and allow passenger trains to operate unhindered where they are viable and to disappear where they are not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Skutelis, you may proceed.
Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Paul Skutelis, President and CEO of the American Public Transportation Association, also known as APTA. At the outset, I want to thank you, Chairman Lipinski, and express APTA's deep gratitude for all that you've done for passenger rail during your time in Congress. I do not remember a previous time when commuter rail issues have been at the forefront of the T&I Committee's agenda than during your tenure, and for that, we thank you. Commuter rail is critical to our economy, creating and supporting more than 200,000 jobs. Prior to COVID-19, the pandemic, 32 agencies operating as commuter railroads safely carried more than 500 million passenger trips a year, and ridership had grown over 9% over the last decade. Commuter railroads' success in advancing their reach is dependent in part on the Surface Transportation Board and its ability to adjudicate service disputes that come before it. Commuter rail connects people to jobs and to opportunity each and every day. For passenger railroads, including commuter rail, higher speed rail as well, access to freight railroad rights of way is essential to expand existing or to initiate new service. Commuter railroads are often at a disadvantage when seeking to utilize freight rail rights-of-way, as they have no statutory priority for such access. As the committee considers the Surface Transportation Bill in the 117th Congress, APTA would like to work with you and our rail partners to explore the best opportunities to ensure equitable access for all passenger rail on freight rail lines. That said, APTA is grateful for the inclusion of provisions in H.R. 2, the Invest in America Act, to enhance the STB's mediation authority to ensure that commuter rail operators have a fair and equitable process for negotiating passenger rail access on freight rail lines. In addition, as part of a fair and equitable process, we believe that the STB must ensure that any unused capacity on freight rail lines is defined, that the railroad owner is fairly compensated for available capacity, and a process be established to enhance capacity on freight railroad lines where there is insufficient capacity. To that end, APTA recommends that the STB hold a capacity summit to discuss how best to allow for the efficient allocation and use of capacity on freight rail lines for passenger rail operations. Last, we note that the STB is operating without a full complement of board members and are hopeful that the Senate will approve the pending nominations to the STB without delay. If I may turn to safety for a moment, for commuter rail operators and the entire public transportation industry, safety is a core value. It's a non-negotiable operating principle and a promise to our riders. I'm pleased to report that commuter railroads are on track to meet the December 2020 deadline for installing and implementing positive train control. Our commuter rail agencies have devoted tremendous time and resources to ensuring the safety of riders through PTC implementation, and we're grateful for the support of this committee in getting us to the finish line. Another issue that I'd like to touch upon is commuter rail liability insurance. Agencies are facing rapidly escalating costs to procure necessary liability insurance for their operations, with the number of insurers dramatically decreasing over the past several years. Despite commuter railroads' exceptional safety record, a recent survey of APTA's commuter rail agencies revealed that there's been a 60% increase in premium costs for the last 3 years, which is impacting agency operating budgets. There are a number of instances where federal law provides a backstop to cover losses above liability limits or allows for federal intervention in a constrained insurance marketplace. APTA plans to propose a federal liability insurance framework for commuter rail in advance of the next surface transportation authorization for this committee to consider. I also want to take this opportunity to discuss public transportation's continuing need for additional COVID-19 emergency relief. The $25 billion in CARES Act funding provided critical lifeline to the industry, enabled our agencies to serve first responders, hospital workers, and grocery store clerks every day. According to the Federal Transit Administration, public transit agencies have obligated 94% of CARES Act funds, $23.4 billion of the $25 billion appropriated. ASTA estimates that the additional need for emergency funds is now at least $32 billion. Without additional emergency funding, many commuter rail agencies and transit agencies will need to consider cutting services, routes, and furloughing workers. Federal support is critical to ensure that operating agencies, including our commuter rail operators, can reposition themselves to survive and to move forward to serve their communities. Time is of the essence in securing this additional emergency funding. To that end, APTA strongly supports H.R. 925, the HEROES Act, which provides $32 billion of emergency transit funding. We stand ready to work with this committee and Congress to ensure that COVID-19 emergency funding for public transportation is passed before the end of the year. Lastly, APTA is grateful for the robust funding for public transportation and passenger rail in the Invest in America Act and focus on investing commuter rail through the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Program known as CRISI. APTA encourages the committee to continue this robust funding as it considers the Surface Transportation Authorization Bill in the 117th Congress. On behalf of APTA, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify and to share our thoughts on the Surface Transportation Board. Look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Skatelis. At this time, before we begin questions, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from the Rail Passengers Association and the States for Passenger Rail Coalition. So without objection, so ordered, those will be entered into the record. All right, we're now going to move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'm going to begin by recognizing the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to be at another modal briefing in 5 minutes regarding the 737 MAX, so I appreciate the opportunity to go first. I'll just ask one question in the interest of time. Mr. Gardner, it's been presented that essentially it's freight or passenger, it's a zero-sum game. In recently conversing with you, I found out something I didn't know, that you have a history doing dispatch. Would you please give your perspective? I mean, is there a way to both have an efficient rail system for passengers and not impinge upon the freight industry? Mr. Gardner, could you unmute and answer if you're still there?
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. Yes, we. Yeah, can you hear me?
Now we can.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Chairman DeFazio?
Yep. Go ahead. Uh-oh.
Chairman DeFazio, can you hear me?
Off and on.
Okay, thank you. Chairman DeFazio, yes, absolutely. We can find.
I don't know what kind of Wi-Fi or connectivity you got down there, but it's not too good.
I'm sorry, Chairman DeFazio. Can you hear me well?
On and off. Try again. You know, the House has approved Zoom now, haven't they?
Okay. DeFazio, thank you for the question. And we can absolutely make passenger and freight trains work together.
Okay, all right. I guess we'll take that as an answer to be expanded upon at some future time when you have when you're here in person. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got to go to this other briefing.
The chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Ranking Member Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, we see what a rousing success these hybrid hearings are with regard to their technical efficiency and all those other things. So I'm going to go to Mr. Gardner again and see if we can possibly work around this technology glitch. Despite Amtrak's huge losses and potentially slow climb back to normal operations, it was reported last month that Amtrak was circulating a map showing plans to expand at a reported cost of at least $25 billion. Can you please explain these plans, including the funding sources and whether Amtrak assessed rider demand and the need for these new routes? That question was from Mr. Gardner.
Okay.
Again, no, I could hear you better if you were sitting here in the committee room, but we're doing what we can. I'm afraid I'm in the interest of actually getting a productive record. I'm going to ask you to submit your comments for the record. Again, if you would please suspend, I'm going to ask you to submit your comments for the record because we can't hear a word you're saying. And again, a stellar example of the efficiency of these hybrid proceedings. Let me go to Mr. O'Toole. Mr. O'Toole, Amtrak suffered record losses this year as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are your recommendations for how Amtrak should rebuild or restructure to be profitable and attract riders? And again.
Here. All right, I've unmuted now. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has given us an opportunity to sit back and reevaluate our transportation choices. We know from this pandemic and from past natural disasters and recessions and terrorist attacks that the most resilient form of transportation we have is motor vehicles and highways. And yet our government policy in many states, and to some degree at the federal level, is to de-emphasize highways and to emphasize mass transportation, particularly rail transit and urban bus transit. And the problem is that these forms of transportation are not resilient against natural disasters. They're not resilient against recessions. They're not resilient against terrorist attacks. They're not resilient against pandemics. And because of this, we're essentially digging our own hole here when we emphasize these kinds of transportation instead of emphasizing motor vehicles and highways. Now, personally, I don't like to drive. I prefer to bicycle or take a train. But the fact is, most Americans have made their choice. 85 to 90% of our travel is by automobile. Almost all the rest is by airlines. And Amtrak and urban transit are insignificant quantities, and they're not resilient. So we need to be resilient, and that means emphasizing kinds of transportation that are resilient.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. I'm going to attempt to at least get a question on the record. I don't have any faith that it will be answered due to technical difficulties, but I'm going to attempt it again to Mr. Gardner. While you're here, I want to follow up on an RFI that Congressman Gibbs, Perry, Smucker, and I sent you several weeks ago. Thank you for the response regarding my concerns about operating the Biden campaign charter train despite Amtrak's severe cutbacks due to the pandemic. I'm still concerned, however, that you did not answer my question about the total cost to Amtrak of providing this service, which is very important given Amtrak's extremely limited resources and historic demands for taxpayer money right now. I'm hopeful at some point that you can tell me the total cost, which you haven't provided yet, to Amtrak, and whether Amtrak actually even broke even. I won't expect that Amtrak will have made money on that. So I'm concerned that Amtrak is asking for record amounts of taxpayer funding while cutting jobs and services, but not being transparent with Americans about its costs and whether the service to the Biden campaign costs Amtrak money. And so I have 55 seconds remaining. Let me add this. It concerns me that I had to follow up with you to get a straightforward answer at this hearing, that you didn't provide me that information when I and 3 of my colleagues on this committee asked you in writing. If you expect taxpayers to give you record amounts of money to bail you out of the pandemic, we should expect full transparency about Amtrak's costs and spending. Also, if you can make a profit on a specially ordered charter train, you should be able to make a profit on your normal routes and services. And I would point out that it's been brought to my attention that there are 2 privately run metro services in Japan that somehow managed to make a profit. So the statement that all public metro rail is subsidized around the world is not accurate. I'll leave those comments for you and expect those answers in writing. Thank you, and I yield back.
I now will recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to start with very quickly, a non-STB question, but it was in the news this morning. MTA in New York announced what cuts they will have to make if there's not more funding in the COVID relief bill for public transit. So I want to ask Ms. Brown, Chairwoman Brown, what would be the consequences for Metra if there is no further federal relief for Metra?
Question. Thank you, Chairman, for your question. The current ridership we have done for passengers and employees is currently between 8 to 15%, depending on which of the 11 lines that you're riding on, due to pre-pandemic ridership. We saw an increase in numbers prior to the latest spike in positivity, and we continue to service on all lines and have but put out additional trains and service since the reduction service in March for social distancing. Our employees remain the core success, including employees of the Union Pacific and the BNSF operating for the 11 lines. A testament to our dedicated employees is the fact that we have not had to cancel any of our scheduled service due to the pandemic. I hope that answers your question.
Do you have plans for what you would have to do if you do not receive any further funding?
Yes, we do have a plan that we're currently exploring on what would cost if we do have to expand our service further for the pandemic, and we can get back with you in writing with those answers.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment on that to address your question as well? This is Paul Skatelis at APTA.
Yes, you do it quickly because I have another question I'm going to come back to you on. So.
Thank you. We have conducted at APTA a survey of our membership across the board, all commuter rail agencies, bus agencies, multimodal, and determined about 60 days ago that about half of all of the agencies were proposing to reduce services, cut back their routes, and lay off employees if not additional resources were made available to them. And on the business side, it's also true that the businesses supporting the industry are very much hurt by this and impacted, with a third of them, in fact, likely to go out of business altogether unless there is some intervention to provide some additional resource. Thank you for my ability to answer that.
Thank you. And I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to give Mr. Jeffries a minute and then Mr. Skatelis a minute. First, Mr. Jeffries, I assume you don't agree with Mr. Skatelis about giving commuter rail any more leverage in terms of expanded service on freight rail lines. I can give you a minute and then Mr. Skatelis a minute to respond to you. So that's not enough time, but
I'll keep it quick. Thank you for the question. So, as I mentioned in my opening statement, Amtrak is wholly unique in the access rights that it has with regard to freight rail lines, and commuters do not have those rights inherently. And so thus, these arrangements have been made through voluntary agreements between privately owned freight railroads and public commuter railroads. And we believe that strikes the right balance, and we believe the dramatic growth we've seen in commuter rail throughout the country since formation of Amtrak, I think 1 to well over 30 has demonstrated that. And certainly there are challenges that come along, but we found that when new services approached in a proper manner, where both sides get together, have skin in the game, identify clear articulated goals from day one, and appropriate resources are made available, that often agreements are put in place and successful outcomes emerge. So very quick answer, but that's our position. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Skatelis.
Yes, I would say, first of all, we all want a healthy rail system supporting the freight railroads, but we also want to be able to support the needs of our communities and the people who rely on these services. We can't be a one-dimensional society. Everyone does not want to own and operate an automobile. That is a recipe for disaster. We need a multimodal network that really looks to the rights of people, to their ability to move around with social equity, addressing the climate issues, environmental issues that we have. I believe that we must look for win-win solutions. Sure, there are divergent interests on all sides. We need to get together to find out how we can balance those needs and provide for the public.
Thank you. And a very quick question for Chairwoman Begeman and Vice Chair Oberman. Whoever wants to take it, we now have 3 members of the board. And Chairman Begeman, your term is ending at the end of the year. What does it mean to not have a full complement of 5 members on the board? How does that hurt? No.
The board is certainly still able to conduct business. We do not have a quorum requirement in the statute. In fact, years ago, it came down to 1 serving member. Business did go on. Now, I will say that there also has not been litigation to determine that someone else wanted to have a different thought process on that. But at the moment, we don't have a quorum requirement. And with 3, with 2, with 1, business has continued. I will say that my colleagues and I have worked very effectively together, and I appreciate their collaboration. to try to be a productive board. And some of us, and I think Congress, are probably disappointed that there still isn't a full complement of 5 members. If that were to happen, the Sunshine Act would no longer be preventing a majority from speaking to one another and perhaps, deciding certain outcomes. But at the moment, the Sunshine Act prohibits members from speaking directly in a non-public format because you could have an outcome-oriented decision. And so that is not currently allowed. Again, I'm hopeful, and one day there will be 5, but I'm not sure that it will happen on my watch.
Mr. Overman, if you have anything very quickly, 'cause I'm way over time.
I'd just like to add, echo what Chairman Begeman said about the productivity we've had with 3 members, but I'd also underscore not only the ability to interchange with individual board members under the Sunshine Act members, but I very much value the contribution that each additional person makes. Each person brings additional insight, additional intelligence, and experience. I think all of us at the board and the industry will benefit from having a full complement, and I hope we get there. Thank you.
Thank you. My time has expired. Now I'm going to recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Perry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a privilege to serve with you. My question will be for Mr. O'Toole, and I'm going to provide some context, so if you can get unmuted while I do that, we'll be ready to go. Your testimony, supported by Amtrak's audited financial reports, directly contradicts what many see as a carefully manicured narrative spun by Amtrak's leadership that the railroad was nearly profitable, and I put that in quotes, in 2019 and would have been profitable in 2020 but for the pandemic. Now, in September, newly appointed Amtrak CEO and President William Flynn testified before this very subcommittee, projecting what many say is a false narrative that profitability was within Amtrak's grasp prior to the pandemic. When I confronted him with the concerns similar to those you've raised about Amtrak's unusual accounting practices, excluding depreciation from expenses and including state subsidies as revenues, he dismissed the concerns. According to Mr. Flynn, excluding depreciation from the total is merely a result of the decision to report on an adjusted operating income basis rather than on a GAAP basis. And counting state subsidies as passenger revenues is an acceptable practice because it is a payment for services provided by Amtrak. However, it is due to the exclusion of depreciation that reporting on adjusted operating income basis is particularly misguided for capital-intensive industries such as railroads. This concern is amplified by the fact that much of Amtrak's fleet is near or beyond its useful life, and as you highlighted, that depreciation is the second largest operating cost reported in Amtrak's annual financial statement. Moreover, Amtrak is still providing the service to the states without payment of these subsidies, instead requesting $500 million in federal money to make up for the lost, and I quote, revenue, which I think is hardly in line with the payment for services arrangement described by Mr. Flynn. With that, can you expand on the impact of these accounting tricks on the public's perception of Amtrak's profitability and financial viability? And if there is, what, if anything, can be done to force Amtrak to be more transparent with the American people that pay for nearly half of every Amtrak cost with their federal and state tax dollars?
Yes, thank you. It's a surprise to me that so many people believe that Amtrak's Northeast Corridor actually makes a profit, or that it even makes an operating profit. The way that Amtrak claims that it makes an operating profit is that it doesn't allocate depreciation to the various trains in its system. And as a result, most of the depreciation would fall on the Northeast Corridor, because that's where Amtrak owns most of it, the infrastructure that it owns. So by failing to account for depreciation, they are exaggerating the profitability of the Northeast Corridor. If when I sit down and take a look at all the trains in the system, the state-supported trains, the long-distance trains, the Northeast Corridor trains, and I try to allocate depreciation, I find all the trains lose about the same amount of money per passenger mile. And I'm not the only one. The Rail Passengers Association is also critical of Amtrak accounting and believes that that accounting is biased towards the Northeast Corridor for one reason or another. So I think the biggest effect of Amtrak's accounting tricks, as we both call them, is that it makes the Northeast Corridor appear more valuable than it really is, when in fact, the Amtrak only carries about 6% of intercity passenger travel in that corridor. The vast majority of intercity passenger travel is carried on highways in that corridor and in every other corridor in the United States.
Thank you, sir. One follow-up. This is for the APTA rep, Paul, if you can be prepared. Public transit agencies received $25 billion in CARES Act funding, approximately $10 billion more than the annual fare box revenue for all transit agencies combined, in addition to the $12.8 billion allocated for FY20. Despite this massive amount of spending, you claim public transit agencies need an additional $32 billion in federal spending. Otherwise, they will begin cutting routes and furloughing employees. If this request is met, the combined spending between the requested amount, FY20, FY21, and CARES will exceed $82 billion over 2 fiscal years. That amount vastly exceeds the 5-year total under the FAST Act, $61.1 billion. This alleged need cannot be explained by the impact of the pandemic, as far as I can tell, nor can COVID explain the 8% drop in nationwide ridership from 2014 to 2019 and the $106 billion in state of good repair backlog that predated the pandemic. These demands are a transparent attempt to force the taxpayer to bail out the transit sector from a crisis, quite honestly, of their own making. Do you believe, this is a question, do you believe it creates a moral hazard to reward decades of financial irresponsibility and mismanagement with over $80 billion in taxpayer subsidies? And how can you reassure my constituents, my bosses, that transit agencies can be good stewards of taxpayer money moving forward when they have failed to do so in the past?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me begin by sharing with you, first of all, with regards to ridership nationally, just leading up to the pandemic, the 2 quarters preceding, national ridership on transit had been up. And that was in contrast to the decline that you recognized. I will say as well, you've got to really look at the finances of how transit organizations function. You mentioned the fare box revenue, which is a significant portion of their revenue. However, every transit agency also depends on local support of some kind, state or local support for funding their operations. In many cases, it's 50% or higher. And so what the pandemic has done is not only take away the fare box return from ridership, as we saw ridership decline as high as 90% on rail systems and 70% overall for bus systems, but it also took away the notion that we would continue to see increases in sales taxes, payroll taxes, property taxes, and the like, which are some of the means of which support public transit agencies. And they vary by financial structure across the country, just depends on the local circumstances. So the need for those funding is not simply the loss of fare box revenue, it's the loss of other revenue sources for the agencies as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Lipinski, and let me just say that it has been a real honor and a privilege to work with you, and your leadership on this committee will sorely be missed, but we will try to continue on in the manner in which you've led us so ably in the past. Let me ask Mr. Skoutelis. The Northeast Corridor Rail Network is critically important to passenger and freight transportation. In 2019, Amtrak recorded approximately 12.5 million passenger trips, the most on record. The Bureau of Economic Analysis estimates that the states along rail networks produce 20% of the U.S. GDP. Can you share with the committee the national importance of the Northeast Corridor Network to our passenger rail system?
Representative Payne, you're directing that to me as APTA?
Yes, Mrs. Gutierrez.
Yes. Well, certainly it's a critical piece of our transportation network, both in terms of mobility, giving people the options to travel in that corridor, and as you well cited, the economic impact that it has both in that region and really across the country. What's not often recognized is the business aspects of those services. Certainly the people who ride them every day are a top concern, but the benefits derived from many businesses across the country who are not located in the corridor derive benefits from the economic impact of having that generation of new business and income. So it's critically important. It is part of an integrated network of services. Urban transit as well as the intercity transit is something that we are strong advocates for and believe that our people and our communities need options today. They need mobility options, and mobility is a basic freedom that people need to conduct their lives.
Thank you. And to follow up with respect to post-COVID, ridership across the country has been at a historic lows obviously because of the pandemic. When the pandemic is over, we could see a massive uptick in rail ridership with minimal lead time. Now is the time to really make the necessary investments now in the rail infrastructure to prepare for expected levels of demand. What investments are needed in our rail network to meet this demand, and what's standing in the way of these investments?
Well, I would tell you that by the DOT's, U.S. DOT's own accounting, there's over $100 billion of state of good repair needs to modernize our urban transit systems that's not been addressed. And we would be looking in the next authorization that be addressed in large measure, because we need to provide modernized services for people. That takes investment in new facilities and rolling stock and expansion of service. There's no question in my mind that rail services will come back as the economy opens back up again. Should not be a surprise to any of us that while we've seen the economic downturn and the shelter-in-place orders, that chokes off economic activity. Transit, urban transit, intercity rail, and the like really are dependent on moving people, and it's a function of economic activity. So we need to make these investments now to prepare for that time very soon when this economy will begin to be back open and running.
Thank you, sir.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Gardner, it's no secret that I'm a strong proponent of the Gateway program along the Northeast Corridor project, ranging from the Portal North Bridge replacement to building a new tunnel under the Hudson River, which would bring desperately needed upgrades to ensure that passenger operations are not impacted by the decaying infrastructure in those tunnels. How would Amtrak's nationwide passenger rail operations benefit from full completion of the Gateway projects?
Thank you, Congressman Payne. It's a great question. People generally know our Gateway program as an improvement program between Newark, New Jersey, and New York's Penn Station. But as you point out, it has vast impact across our whole network. Roughly 17 million of the 32 million passengers of Amtrak had pre-COVID ride somewhere on the Northeast Corridor, and 2 out of every 3 trips begin or end at Penn Station. All the routes to the Southeast, of course, begin at Penn Station for our long distance trains and head through this area. Loss of mobility underneath the Hudson through our North River tunnels would have catastrophic impacts. And we don't need to wonder about this. We saw it after Sandy, and we see it when we do have infrastructure problems that render our current crossing disrupted. So there's a massive impact across our entire Northeast Corridor because New York really is the epicenter of the rail system for passengers. It's New York Penn Station is the largest and busiest transportation facility in North America. and 450 or so thousand riders a day. And they all rely on 1910 era infrastructure to deliver essentially full capacity service. And we, through the Gateway program with our partnerships with the two states and with the Department of Transportation, aim to upgrade this infrastructure, to make it reliable, to put it in a state of good repair, and then begin an expansion program so that rail can continue to grow as an important means of transportation in the corridor.
Thank you. Absolutely. People don't understand if that North Portal Bridge fails, traffic stops between Boston and Washington, D.C. So it's crucial, and that tunnel as well. So it's very vital that people understand what that project means to the Northeast Corridor vis-a-vis and also the country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lipinski. Dan, it's been great to be on your subcommittee. It's been great to serve with you in this great institution. You're somebody who just gets things done. And this committee and all of us on it, on both sides of the aisle, are going to miss you. I'm going to miss you here because you're one of my good friends. And to know that you're not going to be a voice I can go to on rail issues on a regular basis is difficult. But I know that I can still pick up the phone and give you a ring. I just appreciate you, and I want to make sure that I got a chance to say that at this hearing. Also, you've made countless friends, and some of them sitting at the table. Mr. Oberman, unfortunately for both of us, Mr. Jeffries also. But, you've made a difference too. Look at what happened with Create in Chicago. I see the benefits of that in my district downstate, what you have done over your time here in this institution. You're going to leave a legacy of success when it comes to transportation, but you're also going to be leaving a lot of friendships that will never go away because you are such a good friend. And I thank you for that, sir. I do want to say thanks to the witnesses. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about issues that affect my district, especially with Amtrak. And I wanted to go to Mr. Gardner with the time that I have left in regards to the Illini-Saluki service in central Illinois. I spoke with your CEO just a few months ago, and I want to know what has been done to further address the possible short shunting issues that are causing some delays on that line that are just unfathomable and really impacting my constituents' ability to use your service. What can we do? What can we learn from you as to how that is being addressed right now, sir?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. As you referenced, we have a unique condition on that line with Canadian National, where we've had some issues with shunting, and this is shunting of the circuits for grade crossing protection. We've been doing cooperative work with CN to try and identify and rectify this issue. It's a complicated set of circumstances to try and figure out. In the immediate period, we have addressed the issue by having additional fleet that allows us to operate through this section. And current performance with Canadian National has actually become quite good. We think they've made dispatching improvements, and we're at roughly 80% on-time performance for the current route as a result of improvements that CN has made. We continue to work with CN on looking at some technological solutions. We have some new technology that's coming, a little bit delayed by COVID, and being able to get both some equipment and expertise from overseas relative to some technology we're looking at. But we are working cooperatively with CN. We have a good relationship there, and are seeing in the immediate period better performance. We still aim to adjust the schedules there and get better performance as we see today. On the current schedule, we think there's more to achieve. And we think with the new metrics and standards rule and being able to redistribute the schedule time for customer OTP, we can get further better performance. But right now, we continue to work with CN, and we're going to be trying out some new technology here shortly. And we're dealing with the immediate issue by having lengthened trains. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And as I said my previous questions, your CEO, Mr. Flynn, that we are, now's the best time when ridership is down to address these technological issues. Do you know if the Illinois Department of Transportation has been able to place any orders on the technology that could be helpful in addressing this short shun issue on that route, since it doesn't seem to affect any other Illinois routes?
So we, as far as I understand it, Amtrak and CN are looking at this, and we are out to procure some additional equipment here to test this technology in the environment. As you say, it is a unique circumstance to this one area, and so we've worked together, and FRA has been part of our conversations to understand what is driving this condition, but we are going to test this new technology, and we are hopeful that we'll find a good solution other than the lengthy concepts we have today. And as you pointed out, now's the exact time we want to solve this, so that as we recover from the pandemic and envision serving more passengers, we can do so reliably to your district and with better performance over that route.
Well, as you can tell, until we see some solutions, I'm going to continue to ask you to address this issue, and probably with a little more impatience each and every time. I certainly hope we can continue to work together, and I appreciate the information and also being here today to answer our questions. And with that, Chairman Lipinski, probably for the first time ever, I'm actually yielding back some time.
Well, it looks like you're yielding back time, but actually the clock started late. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you not taking the extra time you're given there. But thank you for your kind words, and good luck with everything moving forward.
Thank you, sir.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Malinowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your continuing service. It has been such a pleasure for me to work with you and learn from you in the last couple of years. I have a couple of questions. I first want to respond to a point that was made just a little while back, a suggestion that somehow there is a moral hazard created by the federal government subsidizing or investing in our nation's passenger rail and rail infrastructure. It's a very, very strange comment to make, recognizing that, in fact, taxpayers subsidize every form of transportation in the United States, including all of us who drive cars on our nation's highways, which, after all, are not built or maintained by the private sector. And we do it because not just as a public service, but because we recognize that transit of all kinds is absolutely critical to keeping our economy moving. I wish that didn't have to be said, but here we are. I have a couple of questions for Mr. Gardner, building on some of the points that my colleague, Mr. Payne, made. Back in September, we had a hearing with the Amtrak CEO, Mr. Flynn, and in an exchange with me, he told me that he was hopeful that the Portal North Bridge, a key part of this Northeast Corridor work that we have to do, the construction on the Portal North Bridge could begin as soon as early 2021. And so, Mr. Gardner, I wanted to just ask if you have any updates for us on that, any more definitive estimates of when we will see work actually beginning on that critical bridge.
Thank you, Congressman Malinowski. We are making good progress on the Portal North Bridge program. As you know, the critical next step is to achieve a full funding grant agreement between the Federal Transit Administration and New Jersey Transit. And so I know that New Jersey Transit is working very hard with FTA to accomplish that, with the goal of completing it certainly this year, the end of this year. We have a role in that in that arrangement by just cementing our agreements with New Jersey Transit on their execution of the program, and that's going well. If we are able to complete that work, then New Jersey Transit, I think, will begin the process early next year of going out to market and looking at ways to start the full construction next year. So that's the critical last piece of the puzzle. Amtrak's received additional funding from the FRA through grant program. Amtrak has its dollars in place. New Jersey Transit has its dollars in place. And this last piece of the Federal Transit Administration CIG program is really the final remaining element. And we can begin on this project, which we've been in planning for and hoping to develop for well over a decade at this point.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. And then, of course, there's the Hudson River Tunnel. And, you know, I trust you agree it's promising that on January, we will be swearing in a guy whose nickname is Amtrak Joe to be President of the United States. There have been a number of blockages to proceeding with this next critical stage of the Gateway project. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the procedural levers that a new administration could pull to allow this project to go forward. Specifically, what are some of the early steps a new administration committed to completing this project could take, should take, to let it get started?
Thank you. Well, there are really three, I think, core steps that immediately need to be taken in order to advance the program. First, like the other witnesses here today, Amtrak is in dire need of additional support financially to get through the COVID pandemic. And we've requested $2.9 billion in additional funding to be able to fully restore our service, recall employees who are furloughed, and keep our capital program going. That's important because if we don't do that, we don't have the capital dollars at Amtrak that will be necessary to undertake some of the elements of the Gateway program. So that's essential. Number two, we need the record of decision to be finalized for the Hudson Tunnel EIS. This is an environmental impact statement. The department has been reviewing that for several years now, and that record of decision, final EIS, needs to be issued. With that, we can begin a whole series of activities to advance the program right away. Next, we need support from administration recommending that the Hudson Tunnel program be funded through the budget process for the CIG program, start to build the financial capacity to undertake the project. So those are all important early steps. And we are ready to go at Amtrak. Even in these very difficult times, just to put that in context, we had 13,000 passengers yesterday on the Amtrak system instead of the normal 100,000 we would have in a day. So very challenging times, but we are continuing to keep our capacity to advance an essential project like Gateway so that when we come out of this pandemic, we are there to serve America and increase rail's role in the region.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Bevins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Good morning to you all, and thank you for participating in this hearing today. As you may all know, the Texas high-speed rail project is fairly controversial. Costs have tripled, even though construction has not started. There is opposition from local officials and landowners. And the company in charge of the project, Texas Central, has reneged on their original promise that the project would be privately financed. Most recently, House Democrats included an earmark for the company in their partisan infrastructure package, H.R. 2, that would alter the credit risk premium and make it easier for the Texas High-Speed Railway to get federal RRIF loans, leaving the taxpayers across the country on the hook if the project fails. To that, Texas Central claims that they are unable to pay for the risk premium up front for this project and have requested legislators to change federal law in order to help them qualify for a loan that they otherwise would not be able to receive under the standard rules. To be frank, I believe these decisions should be made at the state and local level, but I do have a few questions on the subject. Chairwoman Begeman, it is my understanding that Texas Central must file and the board must approve a full application in order for the company to have the authority to construct. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay, thank you. And again, to you again, Chairwoman, what role does the financial feasibility play into the board's decision to grant or to deny a full application to the board for construction and operational permits?
I would say it will have an important role. I don't want to prejudge an outcome, so I'm going to sort of give you more of a historical viewpoint. A few years ago, the board considered a case from an entity that actually wanted to develop a very large freight network around the Chicago area. As you can imagine, it had quite a bit of attention and I would say controversy from many communities and leaders, and of course also had a lot of proponents. And one of the things that the board asked the applicant to do or the advocate to do was to disclose what their finance availability was in order to complete the project. And we learned roughly that they had $113, and that was really all the board needed to say no.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. O'Toole, does it worry you that Texas Central's project costs continue to skyrocket, lacks the necessary land to build the train, and that some transportation experts like the Reason Foundation have noted that the company's ridership projects are inflated?
Well, even if we accept the ridership projections of the Texas Central at their current estimated construction costs, they would have to charge every single rider $255 per one-way trip to just cover construction costs amortized over 30 years. And additional, they would have to charge enough to cover operating costs. So the tickets would start at $300. You compare that with the cost of flying in the same corridor, which would be faster. Currently, Southwest and American and other airlines are charging about $100 a ticket. There's no way that Texas Central can be competitive. And the whole problem with high-speed rail is that it requires a huge amount of expensive to build and expensive to maintain infrastructure that the airlines don't need. Basically, the airlines' infrastructure is the air. So they don't need a lot of infrastructure, and so they can be extremely competitive. The whole idea that airlines are only competitive at above 500 or above 600-mile distances is belied by the fact that there are 35 to 45 flights a day between Dallas and Houston. Right. There's 30 flights a day between Portland and Seattle, which is only 160 miles apart. There are a lot of places where there are a lot of flights that are much shorter than 600 miles, and most of the people on those flights are just going from point A to point B. They're not using it to connect to other places.
Thank you very much. Just a few seconds left, and back to Chairwoman Begeman. What steps will be taken by the board to address that the serious financial concerns raised by the local landowners and officials are adequately addressed?
Sir, we have a process where anyone is allowed to participate in our proceedings, particularly on a situation a situation involving a proposed high-speed rail project or a proposed freight project. Communities, Congress people, senators, anyone can submit their views to the board, and they will be posted. The board will consider them. We read all of our filings, and we will certainly, take everyone's views into account and try to make the most appropriate decision based on the law and the facts.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank both of you, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so we're going to go to. Chair will now recognize Ms. Johnson for 5 minutes. Is Ms. Johnson there right now? All right, the chair will recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I make my remarks, I also want to note that you will leave a great legacy, a second generation legacy during your time and service on this committee that will speak loudly for itself. I want to thank you for all of your service over all of these years, and I want to pretty much echo the sentiment expressed by my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Davis, earlier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for putting together this all-important hearing, and thanks to our distinguished witnesses. I'm always delighted to welcome folks from Chicago, and I'm glad to have Metra, our commuter rail in Northeast Illinois, joining us today. A shout out to both Chair Romaine Brown and Vice Chair Marty Oberman. Commuter rail, like many of our critical transportation modes, like the aviation industry, transit, etc., have been hit particularly hard by COVID pandemic. Each of you gave us a snapshot of how dire the situation is for your organization. Rising cases across the country and the reissuance of stay-at-home orders is devastating for the transportation sector. Behind those numbers are the employees, our frontline essential workers who are on the brink too. Mothers and fathers scared to bring COVID-19 home and expose their families, but still they roll up their sleeves and they head to work every day, keeping our economy and many other essential workers like doctors and nurses on the move, whether it's commuter rail or our public transportation agencies. We need to get it straight. Keeping our public transportation agencies, including commuter rail, going, it's not just an option, it's a lifeline. It keeps our essential workforce going, and now more than ever, government must step up. That's why I fought hard to build support for the $25 billion in the CARES Act and the additional $32 billion in HEROES. This aid cannot wait. The chairman has asked questions about COVID and Metra's financial fiscal outlook. I want to ask a different question of Ms. Brown on the topic of the Surface Transportation Board. In your opinion, what role can they play in the short term and long term to ensure that we have a robust and thriving commuter rail system? Ms. Brown? Were you able to hear me, Ms. Brown?
Can Ms. Brown hear us? Perhaps they're having technical difficulties.
Sorry to hear that.
Congressman, because we are experiencing some technical difficulties on my end, is it possible to get the question repeated, please?
Yes, my question, Ms. Brown, is on the topic of the Surface Transportation Board. In your opinion, what role can it play in the short term and long term to ensure that we have a robust and thriving commuter rail system? Was that audible?
If Ms. Brown, maybe try to turn off the video and see if that works better. Yeah, video is going on and off, so we can get Ms. Brown. If not, if Mr. Garcia wants to decide if he wants to move on or.
Yeah, maybe if we can convey that question to Ms. Brown, if she can get back to me in writing, that'd be fine. Let me proceed to a question for Mr. Vice Chair Oberman. In the past years, when Amtrak established new or expanded service, host railroads often sought levels of infrastructure investment that were vastly different from Amtrak's estimates. The process for restoring disputes around infrastructure improvements between Amtrak and its host railroads can take years and leads to unreasonably long delays in providing the public with passenger rail service they need. What tools does the present Surface Transportation Board need to expedite the process of adjudicating disputes between Amtrak and various host railroads?
Well, that's an excellent question, Congressman, and it's great to see you today. And I'm delighted to see so many members of the Chicago City Council and Metra represented at this hearing, of which you and I are graduates of both, or at least one. As Chairman Begeman outlined at the beginning, the board has limited jurisdiction currently over matters involving the freight railroads and Amtrak. Of course, there is the entirely new proposal that's just been issued by FRA on on-time performance, which will then allow the board to begin to investigate and adjudicate on-time performance matters. To my knowledge, we don't have jurisdiction to mandate infrastructure improvements by freight railroads in order to allow them to better serve Amtrak. If that is an authority that the Congress chose to enable the board to deal with, we would then be in a position to investigate matters in that area. I would note that presently, when freight railroads have reduced infrastructure, such after 1970, such as removing double tracking in certain places, the commission, ICC, and then the board had no jurisdiction over regulating the freight railroads' decisions to remove that kind of infrastructure. So that happened without the board's oversight in the past, and still would. There are certain limited kinds of the infrastructure which we don't rule on. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the current authority is very limited. And to the extent infrastructure is related to the Amtrak's ability to have better performance, that would be something that Congress would have to deal with.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answer. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Mr. Pence for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lipinski, and very good luck. Godspeed to you in your next endeavor. And thank Ranking Member Crawford for holding this hearing, and thank you all the witnesses for being here today. As a national leader in both pass-through highways and rail track mileage, Indiana has earned our nickname as the Crossroads of America. With over 940,000 Amtrak riders annually and nearly 4,000 miles of total rail trackage, we are also significantly invested in the safety and efficiency of robust passenger rail systems. Last month, Governor Eric Holcomb broke ground on the $945 million West Lake Corridor South Shore line. This extension project will bring Hoosiers a streamlined connection to the Chicago economy. The state's new commuter rail will boost our accessibility and encourage prosperity for generations to come. We are growing jobs, private investment, and creating new opportunities for Hoosiers. I was proud to advocate for FTA's SIG program in both the FY20 and FY21 appropriation process. I'm especially honored to see $355 million in SIG funds awarded to the South Shore Line's Westlake Corridor. I applaud Governor Holcomb, my fellow Hoosiers in Congress, and all the local leaders on this monumental economic development win for my state, Indiana. For 30 years, leaders in Indiana have worked hand in hand with Washington to put together one of the largest bipartisan transit investments in our state. I also and especially want to recognize my friend, Congressman Visklosky, who has worked tirelessly to see this project through over the last 30 years. I say to you, Congressman, well done, good and faithful servant. I look forward to our continued partnership in bringing infrastructure investment to Indiana. I thank you, and I yield back.
The chair will now recognize Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Can they see me? Yes. I hope you can hear me, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate this hearing and have some special questions for Amtrak because, of course, not only is Amtrak essential for our country, it has its hub here in the District of Columbia that I represent. So I have a question for Mr. Gardner. The committee had a hearing last September on Amtrak's response to COVID-19. Since then, not only has the virus continued, we see it as more vicious, and now it is out of control, we are told, in our country. Have there been any additional personnel or service changes since our last hearing because of this, because of your response to COVID-19?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you noted, the rate of infections have dramatically increased, and we are seeing impacts on our network. We've seen an increase in positive cases for our employees, and we have seen some reduction in ridership. As you anticipate, these problems will make it harder for us to sustain financially these next several months. And as you know, we were hoping that Congress would have enacted additional COVID funding and relief for Amtrak, and as well as our other partners, our state partners, our commuter partners. That has not yet happened, and we have taken a series of steps to try to maintain the financial footing of the company, but the current rise in cases does give us concern about additional revenue that we had hoped for, anticipated over these next several months, and again reinforces the really urgent need for Congress to provide supplemental support so that we can maintain proper service, keep our employees working, and be prepared to recover.
Well, I'm concerned because Congress itself invested in Amtrak when there was concern that we wouldn't have any more Amtrak. So in addition to whatever funds that other railroads may need, Amtrak is in a perhaps unique position with respect to federal funding. So I'm very concerned and hope you will keep us informed, because Mr. O'Toole's testimony, as I read, seemed to suggest that Amtrak services only a small population. Of course, that caught my attention here in the district, because the district has more than 37 million people a year pass through Union Station, many of whom, of course, use Amtrak. Can you speak to the unique role that Amtrak plays in our transportation system. We know it's used heavily here on the East Coast, but it's used around the country. Could you speak more generally to Amtrak's role in our transportation system in the East Coast and nationwide?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Mr. O'Toole's testimony seems to, in a way, prove our point, which is that Amtrak is an excellent addition to mobility in places like the Northeast Corridor, where we have good infrastructure, multiple frequencies, and competitive trip times. And we make a huge impact on the corridor. Many million riders a year who provide this, who take our service, as you know, and we provide significantly more trips between Washington and New York, for instance, than the airlines. And this infrastructure does far more than just support Amtrak. To his point about depreciation, the depreciation associated with that infrastructure provides essentially over 2,000 daily trips pre-COVID of trains up and down the corridor, serves 750,000 passengers a day, 260 million trips a year, because it covers not only Amtrak, but 8 commuter users, 4 freight users. It's a national infrastructure that serves an entire region, and not any region, a region of more than 50 million people producing 20% of the GDP. So that capital investment is one that the federal government has made through Amtrak and is there producing tremendous results. What we aim to do is take this successful prototype, and we have other examples in the Midwest and the Chicago hub, as the chairman well knows, in our California services, which supported by the state of California and Pacific Northwest, examples where passenger rail makes a real contribution, and it does so by offering trip time competitive trips, multiple frequencies, and reliable service. The reason we aren't doing more in the United States and aren't able to provide more value is because we don't have great access to the rest of this large network around America. There are many areas where passenger rail can provide the kind of meaningful service it does in the Northeast, but we need a fair and quick way to get access to the infrastructure to provide such trips, and appropriate funding through both the states and the federal government.
You say you don't have access. When you say you don't have access to the rest of the country, what do you mean by that?
So, Congresswoman, under statute, we are given the right to use freight railroad infrastructure across the network, but the process of doing so is very cumbersome and difficult. Not all, but some of our freight colleagues really look to make it very difficult for us to use their infrastructure to add service or start new routes. And
is there anything Congress can do about that?
Yes, and in fact, already in the Surface Transportation Reauthorization bill you put forward, or the committee, and passed the House, we make some important changes to statute to help speed up our process and give us more rights, help us achieve the preference we should get under statute over freight transportation. We need those provisions to be enacted into law, and we could use your support in terms of funding and resources for the STB so they can carry out their roles as well.
I appreciate that. When you consider the concerns that we have about transportation, this is one of the cleanest forms of transportation in the United States or in the world. If I have time, I have a question for Mr. Skouloudis, because in his testimony, he says that APTA commissioned a study of COVID transmission on transit and found no direct correlation between the use of urban transit and transmission or contraction of the virus. I was impressed by that, and I wondered why so. Is it because there are so many rules, because of the enforcement of rules, because people are abiding by the rules? Could you speak to that, sir?
Thank you so much for that question. In the weeks following the outbreak of the pandemic, we saw quite a bit in the media about the genesis of where these contractions were occurring from the pandemic and the virus, and a lot was attributed to, I think, inappropriately, to public transit use. And so we looked around the world really to gain experience of what has transpired over these many months since the pandemic outbreak, and have determined both in Asia and in Europe and really here in the United States, the studies that have been done found that public transit is not the source of that. In fact, oftentimes it's the endpoints where people are starting, perhaps their homes or some other place of destination. You know, people are on transit generally for a pretty short period of time. And our agencies have all adopted very rigorous disinfecting and cleansing protocols that they've put into place really since the very beginning of the outbreak in March, including—
There's no correlation. So if somebody's infected and they board a transit, of course they're bringing that onto transit. Are you saying they're there for such a short period of time that the virus isn't transmitted while in Germany?
Well, I think what the studies have shown is with all the measures that transit has put in place, the wearing of face coverings by their own employees, the frontline workers, encouraging, if not mandating as such, by riders, and all the cleaning, again, that has been done at stations and at rolling stock buses and trains, it really has diminished that possibility. And in addition to that, the social distancing that most of our agencies have done as well to keep people separated as much as possible. Those all have contributed to that. So we want to make sure that message is out. We recently convened and concluded a national task force looking specifically at these issues and have laid out a whole framework of practices that we think are to be followed and in large measure are being followed, which I think greatly diminishes that possibility.
That's very helpful to hear.
Thank you.
And I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Thornton. Mr. Catellus, Chair will now recognize Mr. Lamalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lipinski, and I just wanted to say it's been a pleasure. You're a true gentleman, and I enjoyed the opportunity to serve with you, so thank you, sir. Just a couple for Mr. Gardner, and I'll also for Mr. O'Toole at Cato here. In my own district here, talking about Amtrak train service, we have a city called Dunsmuir in Northern California. It's between Redding on the north side of the northern part of California, and I believe the next two stops north of that in Oregon would be Medford and or Klamath Falls. If I'm not mistaken, maybe Medford is a bus route, but the threat here is that the Dunsmuir stop is going to be closed down, and there's of course great concern in the local community on that because it's although a small town, it really does punch above its weight, so to speak, on its usage there. And with the challenges you have in Siskiyou County with weather, where this location is that the train can go when the highway cannot. And this station is really the only non-roadway transportation link in the area there in Northern California. So the loss of the station would be pretty devastating for passenger service and a lot of just local transportation concerns in the region. So for Mr. Gardner, again, we've several occasions this year because of during CARES Act and COVID response, taxpayers were pretty generous with Amtrak and expect service from that, or at least the availability of service. When $1.02 billion in March via CARES Act, and then requests later for $1.475 billion, and then even in late, that was in May, then August, a number of $2.05 billion that got kicked up to $4.8 billion. So a lot of dollars being pushed around, and I'm certainly not anti-rail service, but we have great concerns that are we getting the bang for the buck to our taxpayers in order to keep this alive and viable, especially with the closure of stations and the cutback of trains. So is this right, Mr. Gardner, for us to be witnessing the possible cutback of even more service, especially what we're talking about in Dunsmuir, California, which is a really important link in a tough transportation situation?
Thank you very much for the question. I had the pleasure of being to Dunsmuir, a beautiful part of California. And in fact, we fully intend to continue to serve Dunsmuir. I think what you, it's part of our Coast Starlight route, and probably what you are aware of is that we've had to reduce service to 3 times a week for our long distance network. That is actually because we were unable to achieve the additional funding we had requested from Congress in order to forestall those kind of cuts. And so we fully intend to restore that service back to 7 days a week and of course serve Dunsmuir. So that's why we've asked for these additional dollars. We do want to continue to serve Dunsmuir and bring the long distance network, including the Coast Starlight, back to its 7-day-a-week schedule.
Let me ask a technical question on that then. Are the trains traveling through 7 days a week, but they just don't stop each time? Or is it that you're just not running trains at all through the entire region 7 days a week?
The latter, Congressman. So we are only running that train 3 times a week. So it's not running on the other 4 days. And we've done that in order to reduce expense because we've not been able to receive additional funds for FY21. As you noted, we did receive funds in FY20 under the CARES Act, and that was essential to keeping the long distance network operating at 7 days a week. But without additional funding, we've had to take these steps to reduce cost and service to meet the very, very low demand. So yesterday, there was 2,500 passengers on our whole long distance network. But we intend to fully restore that service as soon as we're financially able to, and or when demand returns to its other levels.
Okay, I can certainly see that. So is there a scenario where you would have run trains through there that don't necessarily stop but keep going? And if you're running the trains, will you continue to use each of the stations that you have in the past, including Dunsmuir?
Yes, certainly. I'm aware of no plans that Amtrak has to not service Dunsmuir, and we are. The only reason the service is reduced is because the train frequency has been reduced. And as we increase that frequency with Congress's support, we would be able to increase service again.
Okay, because when you see service that way, then you see people go to other modes, if at all possible. So you lose that market share, and I think we've seen that in the past with others. Once you reduce it, maybe they don't come back when they find other ways to do that, but that wouldn't necessarily apply to this region here. So I wanted to also delve into another thought here too. And it was talked about earlier. I'm sorry I had to go out of the room for yet another Zoom call. How would giving Amtrak greater preference over freight trains affect Amtrak's ridership? I mean, because we know freight is an extremely important and big part of rail usage. And if this was asked earlier, forgive me, but if Amtrak got greater preference in order to try and present a better saleability to passengers, what kind of payoff would you see in that, you think, as far as greater usage by ridership?
Yeah, it's a great question. We think that the poor on-time performance that many of our routes have is a significant impediment to ridership and revenue growth. It's quite apparent. Many of our passengers, particularly on our long distance network that serves Dunsmuir, for instance, their routes frequently experience significant delays. The number one cause of those delays are freight train interference. So this is delays encountered that Amtrak encounters when freight trains run in front of us, or otherwise dispatching decisions are made that prioritize the freight trains in front of Amtrak. And the reduction in reliability is clearly a problem for passengers. We have many hour delays. Often our whole long distance network is operating at 50% or less on-time performance if you look at over the many past years. Even right now, through this period of COVID where freight traffic has been down, and we're only at 60% over the last 12 months on-time performance for the entire long distance network. So we see very difficult sort of struggle to market these trains to riders, particularly on the shorter distance, because
I have to economize my time here. I'm sorry, but so what do you think? What is there a number? Can you put your finger on how ridership would improve if you could improve those numbers? We lose you on the link there, Mr. Gardner. Let me jump to Mr. O'Toole while that spools back up, hopefully. Same question, Mr. O'Toole at Cato. Would you see Amtrak, would it improve Amtrak's ridership, you think, if we were able to somehow accomplish a greater preference over freight, which isn't necessarily my position, but I want to ask the question.
Well, as a resident,
if you can make this a brief answer.
Okay, I'm sorry I'm long-winded, but as a resident of Chairman DeFazio's district, I've been to Dunsmuir many times, both by train and by automobile, and I can tell you fewer than 15 people a day get on or off an Amtrak train in Dunsmuir. Now, I think it would be great if we had 2 trains a day between Seattle and Los Angeles, and one of them were able to serve Dunsmuir in daylight and the other one at nighttime instead of just one at night as it is today. But effectively, Amtrak's market share in that corridor is indistinguishable from zero. So even if you had 2 trains a day, even if they ran on time every day, you might be able to double that from 0 to 0. It's not going to be relevant. It's going to be extremely costly, but not relevant.
All right, Mr. Gardner, are you back up
Thank
here
you.
again?
I am, yeah.
Well, if you can make this quick.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. We think there'll be a significant increase in ridership. We've seen it that every point of on-time performance equates to increased ridership and revenue, and our costs would significantly be reduced if we didn't incur as much delay, because we take lots of cost as a result of delay.
When do you anticipate going to 4 a week or 5 a week, up from the 3?
Well, it
this
depends.
will have to be the last answer here.
Thank you.
If we receive the funding we've asked for, we would restore our service as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say to you, Dan, we're going to miss you. You are one heck of a stand-up guy. So I just appreciate having served with you. I'm going to go first to Mr. O'Toole, if I can. Mr. O'Toole, one of our questions is, how does Amtrak compare to airlines and motor vehicles in terms of ridership, and then also in demand and profit? And then I'll expound on that a little bit. How does Amtrak compare to airlines and motor vehicles in terms of ridership and profit?
Well, motor vehicles effectively have 90% of the market share in this country. Airlines have 10%. Amtrak and urban rail transit has well under 1% together. Amtrak's is 0.1% of all ridership.
And I'm going to be a little brief if I can. So obviously the profit is going to be way down. And in some sense, I think we would all agree that's really not, that's almost apples and oranges. It's not a fair comparison per se, but it does point out some interesting things. The number of jobs, if you know, that Amtrak represents, and then the freight rails. We're going to focus on just the freight companies themselves. What's the difference there in jobs? Does Cato know that?
I don't have those numbers offhand. Stephen Gardner might, but obviously the freight rails, which move 1/3 of all the freight moved in this country, are going to have a lot more jobs. But the interesting thing is they are have very high worker productivity, whereas Amtrak has extremely low worker productivity. For the number of passengers carried, it requires a lot of workers. So in terms of passengers carried, Amtrak has a lot of jobs, but that doesn't mean they're actually doing productive work in this country.
Right, I get it, and I appreciate it. I'm trying to keep the answers brevity as much as possible. Before the departing chairman, who's a stand-up guy, kicks me off. So I do want to go to Mr. Gardner. Do you know the answer to that question?
Well, Congressman, I believe the freight railroad industry is about 150,000 employees. We're roughly pre-pandemic a little bit shy of 20,000.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for
Congressman,
that. And then let me go very briefly.
If I could chime in on that, absolutely. Freight rail employs about 150,000 right now, and salary and benefits totaling into six figures. When you look at the economic impact of freight rail, we're talking about 2.1 million jobs, direct and indirect impact there.
Right, and that's one of the major points in this discussion, in my opinion. What kind of money, and I'll stay with you then if I can, what kind of money has the rail companies invested in the infrastructure? And then you have to ask the same question, what has Amtrak invested? Back to you.
Sure. So annually, freight railroads are investing about $26 billion in private capital back into their networks. And when we chart that back to partial deregulation in 1980, well exceeds $700 billion in private capital investments.
And Mr. Gardner, how about Amtrak?
Amtrak's been investing about $1.2 billion, $1.3 billion per year over these last several years in our network. Of course, we have a very different network than the freight railroads. We primarily only own our infrastructure in the Northeast Corridor, and then our rolling stock and substation assets. So our capital program is very different, but our economic impact is quite substantial. We also have enormous multiplier effects that occur from our spending, both our payroll and our procurement, and from the benefits we create through mobility.
Yeah, but primarily in the Northeast area, I would imagine, as you pointed out. Interesting question, and I'll throw this back to Mr. O'Toole, is freight high-speed rail, and I've been overseas, seems to work in other countries, but it doesn't work here. Why?
Well, I would first of all question the assertion that it works in other countries. It's not really working in France or China or even Japan, except for in the main corridor between Tokyo and Osaka. One thing we've learned from high-speed rail in countries all over the world is that they've gone heavily into debt to build it, almost to the point where it creates serious problems for their country. Japan's 10 years of stagnation, the lost decade of the 1990s, can be attributed to the debt they built up building high-speed rail. China has a debt of something like $750 billion building high-speed rail. There's no end in sight. I don't think it's working in those countries.
Okay, well,
its market share is small and not growing. Automobile share is growing rapidly in Asia. Airline share is growing rapidly in Europe. Rail share is not.
So very quickly, Mr. Gardner, back to you. So according to Mr. O'Toole's response there, he doesn't think it's working because they're going in depth. And when passenger lines need more access to the rail that freight lines use, how do you suppose other countries make that work? Any insight there?
Yeah, well, absolutely, Congressman. Thank you for the question. I would first say that Mr. O'Toole's assertion is sort of breathtaking. We've got the major developed nations of the world all investing at incredibly robust levels because they see passenger rail and high speed in particular as a means of increasing mobility efficiently and addressing carbon emissions. So I would say that the broad consensus is actually that not only is it working, but it's working and worth more investment. And the difference between the U.S. system and most of the international examples is that the infrastructure is publicly owned and developed in all of these nations, the nations that Mr. O'Toole mentioned. There is a rail infrastructure entity, and they're developing it for both passenger and freight. In some of those locations, they're optimized for passenger service primarily. That's for sure the case. China is a great example of a nation that's investing for both, has a massive freight system and an incredible amount of investment for passenger rail. And again, they see high speed as a means of dealing with their very significant population in an efficient way.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield back, and once again, best wishes to you going forward into your future. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Crawford, and the witnesses for testifying today. I do not have any questions, but I do want to make some comments of our Chairman Lipinski. Chairman, I'm a freshman member on the Republican side, and working with you on the TNI. I just want to say it has been a pleasure for me as a freshman member on the Republican side to watch you operate, your moderate views. You are going to be missed as a member of Congress. You're going to be missed in the Illinois delegation, and you're going to be missed in your district. I so much appreciate the opportunity to have served these past 2 years with you. You are just an unbelievable person, and I appreciate everything that you've done, your moderate stances, and others. And I just want to say thank you very much for your service to this nation. And Congress is better off to have Dan Lipinski in it. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stauber. You waited all that time just for that, so I appreciate it. And thank you for all your work in what you've done in trying to get some important things done for our country. With that, we are going to wrap up this hearing. I thank everyone all the witnesses for their indulgence. It's been 2 hours and 40 minutes, so it's been a long hearing. I very much appreciate all of the testimony here today. And before I finish up the hearing today, I want to make sure that I thank the staff of the subcommittee for all their work this year. Andrea Wallenberg, Alice Cope, Catherine Ambrose. We had Liz Hill here until she moved on to greener pastures as the director. And I want to thank very much Alka Maher Piersma. Alka stepped in when Liz left in the middle of the year and did an excellent job with the subcommittee. So I want to thank all of them for the work that they have done. I just was listening to Al Franken's book about his career in the Senate and said how he learned he's never supposed to say that staff did anything, that it's all the senator. And unfortunately, that's oftentimes the way it is up here on the Hill, that we, the representatives and senators, are supposed to take all the credit for everything, but everyone who really knows how things operate knows that the staff does a tremendous amount of work and is responsible for most things that get done here. And I also want to thank Alex Speckman on my committee, on my staff who does my committee work for the Transportation Committee. Thank Alex for all of his great work for me. So again, thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the record for today's hearing remain open until such time that the witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, everyone stay safe, and the subcommittee is now adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.